Hello, Live Well San Diego. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for honoring us and giving us your time today. We are so excited to be here with you for this next hour. If you are in the right place, you are in the presentation called Reimagining Telehealth, Lessons Learned from Outreach to Rural and Urban Communities. And before we officially start, I'm just going to go ahead and just wait one more minute and let everybody get settled in, let them get their pencils, their water, anything that they might need to take care of themselves during this next hour. So while we wait, I just have two quick announcements. One of them is that we will have closed captioning, and you can find the closed captioning to the right of the Q&A. Just click on the option subtitle. And we do have Caitlin helping us with the closed captioning. Thank you very much, Caitlin. It's going to be more of a summary that you can follow along with because she will be manually typing in everything. But we were so happy that she's able to do that and that we were able to offer it to you guys. Another announcement is that if you have any questions, feel free to use the dialog box. You can find that in the upper right-hand corner. We have Gabriella and Rachel assisting us with the dialog box. They are very excited to be hearing from you guys, getting some of your questions answered. And so we will also be having a Q&A. And so we are really excited to continue to explore this topic together through that avenue. And last but not least, I want to say thank you to Kate, who is also helping us during this presentation. So before we introduce ourselves, I wanted to just take a moment and I wanted to open today's presentation using a beautiful quote by Shannon L. Adler, who shared this meaningful quote that I thought was especially important during this time. She said, "One of the most important things that you can do on this earth is to let people know that they are not alone." And I would like to take a moment and to recognize each and every single one of you guys for all of the work that you do, that you continue to do, that you've been doing. And I want to honor you, celebrate you, and praise you. With that being said, I would like to ask each of you to stop, take a moment, and let's just recognize and give honor to those people who have also been here with us, supporting us, helping us through this time. If it's not someone, maybe it's something or an animal or a place, anything that speaks to you that you feel has really been there for you. I want to just take 10 seconds to really identify that, hang on to that, and just celebrate that. So go ahead. Thank you. So let's begin our presentation, Reimagining Telehealth, Lessons Learned from Outreach to Rural and Urban Communities. My name is Mardina Sparza. I'm an LCSW and a therapist with Mending Matters. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Deanna Yiddy. I'm an ASW and a therapist with Mending Matters.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Lindsay, and I'm also an LCSW and a therapist with Mending Matters. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Martine, for getting us started and giving us a moment to pause and reflect. I would like to share a little bit about who Mending Matters is. Mending Matters is a nonprofit organization that provides school-based mental health services throughout San Diego County. Prior to the pandemic, our services were entirely school-based and in person. Like many of us present here today, the pandemic challenged us to transition the way we provide services, and we transitioned to virtual services following COVID-19. Today, we're here to share with you all some of what we learned making this transition and how we offer services. Today, we'll talk about common barriers for engaging clients in telehealth, strategies to engage individuals and families virtually, and throughout our presentation, we will reflect on best practices for supporting individuals of color, BIPOC, or Black and Indigenous people of color, and multilingual families.
Thank you, Deanna. So before we begin getting into the meat of our presentation, I'm going to start by just giving some context as to how we began this evaluative process that we are going to share with you. So just to paint the picture, it was actually March, Friday the 13th of all days, which I'm sure we all kind of remember March, when we had less than a day's notice that we needed to transition from a school-based and in-person service to solely telehealth, because as we know, the schools all closed down at this time. Our agency, as Deanna mentioned, had not previously utilized telehealth whatsoever, but we all had our kind of a make it work moment, as I'm sure most of you did. And we immediately began to contact our caseload to provide resources and transition students to virtual services. And I admit, I mean, we kind of just hit the ground running come Monday, and I at least thought, okay, I'm going to get all of my students in. I'm going to start seeing them virtually. It's going to be great. But as the weeks went by, several schools of ours struggled to engage students in telehealth. And we realized that we would need to figure out a way to reach these students given the continued and predicted need for virtual services. So in doing so, we found that 4 of our East County San Diego schools had the highest rates of disengagement. So we conducted an evaluation of services at these 4 schools. And you can actually see on the image here, all of our schools and their different locations, and then the 4 schools that we evaluated. And we found that prior to COVID-19, there were 168 students receiving ongoing group or individual therapy. And unfortunately, 110 of these students disengaged from services altogether. And this was for a lot of different reasons. And then there were some students that we just couldn't even contact at all. It was like they totally dropped off the map as soon as the schools closed, which was really discouraging for all of us therapists. So our data evaluated the reasons for disengagement and developed strategies to address these barriers. And this is all of what we're going to talk about in our presentation today. So to begin, we're going to paint a picture of 2 students of the 110 who disengaged from our services, one in an urban community and another in a rural school, to demonstrate some themes that we saw across these various populations and the barriers to accessing virtual services. So I'm going to begin by sharing the urban case study, and you can please feel free to read along with me under Student A. So Student A is a Latinx student who is engaged in regular therapy with Mending Matters from the beginning of the school year. Upon school closure, the therapist reached out to the client and offered teletherapy. The student expressed feeling uncomfortable with teletherapy due to living in a multi-generational household and having no privacy. The student also stated that they would be working to support their family in the pandemic, and they would not have time for therapy sessions. So in this example, we saw a lot of barriers prevalent across our urban schools. Students felt pretty uncomfortable having a private therapy session in their home, which is pretty understandable. When we were in the schools or in our agencies, people can just come in, it's kind of incognito, they can see a therapist and leave. But we were asking a lot of these students to start talking about really personal issues in the comfort of their own home when many of them don't even have a bedroom. of their own. So this was very challenging to overcome, as many of our students were living with family members or did not have their own private space, as I mentioned. In addition, another barrier that we really saw across our population is many of these students started to watch their younger siblings because, as we know, they weren't able to attend school. Many of them still are not. And or they began to support their families through the pandemic. As we know, many families have endured a lot of job loss or job insecurity. So our students kind of rose up and began to start working while juggling going to school and just didn't have time for therapy, which indicated that perhaps they needed some more tangible resources other than therapy, clearly. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we overcame these barriers a little bit later in the presentation. But before we do, Mardine is going to share a real case study with us.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yes, so I would like to share an experience that I had as a rural school-based mental health therapist. So again, I would like to just ask for you guys as I read the case study to just, again, think about some of the barriers that you hear, maybe identify things that were different compared to a student from the urban community. So Student B was engaged in group therapy with Mending Matters prior to the pandemic. Upon school closure, the therapist contacted the student and found out that he was quarantining with a close friend and their family. Due to lack of internet connection and poor cellular reception, the student shared that he would not be able to participate in the group. The parent also reached out for food resources, but it was difficult to access resources because of the distance. So I would like to ask for you guys to just take a moment and utilize that chat and go ahead, and we would love to learn from you and just hear about what your experience was like, barriers you might have faced when serving your population during this time. So go ahead, take a moment, use that chat box. We would love to hear from you guys. So while you guys are continuing to utilize the chat box, I would like to take a moment and put up our Venn diagram, and I would like to just allow you guys a couple of seconds to take a look at that before we dive into it. So continue with the chat if that's what you're finishing, and then go ahead and take a sneak peek at our Venn diagram. Thank you. So the Venn diagram, we just want to share this diagram. It does highlight some of the challenges that we faced. We saw that there were individual challenges to each population, and there were challenges experienced by both communities. For example, there was a shared response in both the urban and the rural schools, really taking that systems approach. More than ever, it was so important for us to really connect our clients to the resources that they had available in their community, whether it was looking at what the school can provide, looking into if they go to any spiritual or church organization, taking a look at what new resources were coming from California for families to connect to. And we just really wanted to strengthen those and have them utilize those supports. In the urban community, one of the challenges that was reported that Caitlin did mention was that there was a shared experience of the lack of privacy. And as Caitlin described, students were able to come in our office. Their families were informed, but they would come in during school. And so there was a lot of privacy with that. And once we were in the at home, many of our families were in multi-generational homes, which made privacy a little bit more challenging. And because of that, family members could have been more aware that they were receiving mental health services. And these students reported that it created some feelings related to shame, and they've also experienced some stigmas. Last, the rural community. Regarding the rural community, as I mentioned in my case study, was that there was limited resources nearby. The other challenge was that these the weather and high winds would shut down the power. And once the power is shut down, it made it really difficult to then be able to do an online session. With the cell phone reception, it's also a challenge because it cuts in and out due to how far away the towers are. And therefore, another challenge was being able to have an uninterrupted telephone conversation. So these were some challenges that we had. So with that, we will move on, and Deanna will then discuss our methods of engagement. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mardine. So yes, as mentioned, there were a lot of barriers that we ran into when thinking about and transitioning to virtual services. There were things we had not anticipated and things that we learned along the way. And I'm going to share with you all some practices we developed as an agency to combat some of the barriers that we came across in making our transition to virtual services. In this section, I will be talking a little bit about how to engage the individuals you're working with, what we learned, given the barriers we experienced, and how to engage the communities and the support systems of the person you're working with. One of the things that we learned in our transition was the importance of consistently reaching out and utilizing all forms of communication. As Caitlin mentioned earlier, some of our students fell off the map after school closed, and we were really challenged with how to connect with the families we had been working with. As mentioned, there were a lot of students engaged regularly in telehealth, and it was discouraging to have challenges around connecting with those individuals and their families. And so we found consistently reaching out and using all forms of communication to be a helpful tool. For example, we would call and follow up that phone call with a text message or an email. And so we oftentimes actually all three. And so we would encourage you all to think about different ways of communicating with the individuals you work with and utilizing all of those forms consistently. Even when we're not always getting a response back, reaching out and making that effort over time, we've found was helpful. And that consistency was helpful for the individuals who were able to re-engage in virtual services. It may be also helpful to assess the person's comfort level in technology literacy. It is challenging to try something new, not just for ourselves as service providers, but for the individuals we work with. So being able to check in about what they know and perhaps what they may not know about how to utilize technology in getting services could be really helpful in supporting you in how to navigate those help those individuals navigate through these challenges. We found it really helpful to share how-to videos and visuals that you're able to walk through with the individual you're working with, so they can see what that video platform might look like so they know what to expect. We also found that partnering with the person we're working with to troubleshoot technology issues ahead of time is really helpful. Being able to plan ahead and anticipate challenges made rolling with those challenges when we were presented with them a lot easier. For example, if I freeze and you can't hear me, please call me or message me so I know. Or if we get disconnected, I'll be the one to call you right away. And so making some plans and assuming and anticipating that technology challenges happen. If you're providing them information on how to connect to a virtual platform, we found it helpful to make a plan for what happens if they're not able to connect. For example, please call me if you can't access that platform, and I'll support you in troubleshooting how to do that. So being able to plan ahead with the individuals we work with. We recognize that some individuals may feel uncomfortable jumping into virtual services, and we found it helpful to communicate whether in whatever manner that they're willing to, whether that meant they're just want a phone call to check in and to continue to offer those virtual services. So if we had students, for example, who weren't comfortable yet doing video sessions, we utilized whatever form that student was willing and able to do. Oftentimes, we would do telephone check-ins and continue to communicate and engage that way until that individual felt comfortable or ready to start those virtual services. As Caitlin mentioned earlier, privacy was an issue for many of the students we worked with. And being able to meet them where they're at and with what they're willing to do, we found it was really helpful. And oftentimes, individuals were willing to try those video platforms down the road. We also found it really important to develop a safety protocol within our organization and with the individuals that we're working with. We would encourage you all, as you're engaging individuals in virtual services, to plan ahead with that individual, to prepare and have those emergency contacts updated. It may also be helpful to have that person's location and list of supports handy. Operating in a virtual world, we found it was important to communicate to the individuals we work with the importance of relying on their support system, given the limitations of virtual services. As Mardine mentioned earlier, we really learned we had to take a systems approach. And by that, we had to reach out to those supports and we had to engage the other individuals in their lives to be able to make virtual services work and to utilize those supports in keeping our students safe. We made it a practice to process our intent to collaborate with their support systems should a safety issue arise. And we discussed location and privacy at the start of every appointment. We recognize that many of the individuals we work with do live in multi-generational homes, and privacy can be a challenge in engaging in virtual services. And that was something we learned we had to plan for and prepare for. As was mentioned earlier, many of our students didn't have that private place to be able to unpack the things going on for them. Oftentimes they didn't have their own space at home, and there were others in the home that could hear them. And so we really needed to process what it would look like for us to do virtual services together. One example in overcoming this barrier in engaging students struggling with this challenge was to plan ahead for what day and time and place that individual would have the most privacy. We got creative with how we would let each other know when the space was no longer private. One example I could think of was planning with students. What happens if someone walks into the room? What happens if someone comes in and we are no longer in a private space? How can you let me know? One tool that was helpful and we utilized was coming up with a signal or a word. We tried to make it fun. For example, if my sister walks in, I'm going to hold up my finger so that I let the therapist know we're not alone anymore. And so really allowing the student to be aware that we know there's challenges and we know there are other people in the home with them, and we recognize that and we want to honor their time and their space, and we want to be mindful. So making it fun and creating a special word or a hand signal to let us know they were no longer alone was really helpful, and it really empowered the individuals we work with to find that space in a virtual world. When engaging individuals in virtual services, we learned we had to be flexible in the way that we offer these services. As mentioned, we were an in-person, school-based therapy support, and suddenly, following COVID, we had to take on a more case management role. We had to recognize the disruption that COVID caused for many of our families and students. And the disruption COVID really caused across families all across San Diego County. And by providing resources and staying up to date with new resources available for families, we were able to meet families and students where they were at. We created a resource guide that included mental health content. And in those ways, we were able to provide families with support in meeting their basic needs, which continues to be a priority for many of the families that we work with. As mentioned earlier, many of the individuals we work with took on jobs at the start of COVID to support their families and the adults in their home who may have lost their job. We saw this example in our first case study where the student really had to take on more responsibilities at home, and therapy no longer became a priority as that student had to support their family in different ways. We also recognize that some individuals weren't worried about therapy. Therapy became secondary to supporting their families who were worried about getting food and paying their bills. Mental health support was no longer a priority. And so as an agency that primarily provided mental health support, we had to be flexible and meet our families where they were at and what they were needing in that moment. So when engaging individuals in virtual services, we encourage you all to stay flexible and to continue to inquire about the basic needs of the individuals you work with. Flexibility was a large part of what we learned when making this transition to virtual services. Being adaptable when providing virtual services and flexible with goals and appointment times, even appointment length, was helpful in meeting individuals where they were at during a global pandemic. We had students who weren't able to engage in therapy but could do a 10-minute check-in by phone. And we really had to be adaptable to what our students needed and were able to give us and were able to give themselves in those moments when so many other pieces of their life were calling their attention. As we mentioned throughout our presentation, and as we saw present in those vignettes, many of the individuals we worked with took on a big role in their home, caring for their siblings, supporting siblings through their schoolwork and Zoom calls, while managing their own schoolwork and Zoom calls. And we had to be flexible with those appointment times and when the student could be available to engage in services. And flexible with how we would meet with those students and where. Whether a student was meeting in their car because they didn't have privacy in the home, or whether they were meeting later in the day as they were finding time and space to adjust to the demands of a pandemic. We had to meet our families and our students where they were at and with what they needed at that time. So we had to adjust our own expectations of what it means to be a service provider and to provide services in general. Then, once we got students engaged in virtual services, we were presented with another challenge. How do we make it interactive? How do we make it fun? We modified our interventions and we worked really hard to make telehealth a strength, not just for our students, but for ourselves as service providers. Meeting virtually, we were able to see our students in another way. Being entirely school-based meant we saw our students in one specific setting every week, but virtual services allowed us to see their homes and their rooms. We got to meet a lot of furry friends and see the things that were important and meaningful in their space, and that meant a lot. And we had to adjust and reframe our own experience with virtual services. And we tried our best to get creative and to make telehealth as fun as possible so that our students were willing to continue to engage. So those were some of the big pieces in engaging individuals in telehealth. But I also want to take a moment to recognize the cultural strengths and interventions commonly used for individuals. Often, as professionals and as service providers, we feel the pressure to know and do for our clients and students as much as we can. But it's important for us to recognize the strengths that each individual shows up with, all on their own. The strengths of their culture and their family, and how they were coping with the disruption in their lives and all of our lives. We encourage you all to think about and ask the individuals you work with how they are able to manage stress. What within their culture and their family do they use to get through difficult times? Explore those strengths. And if you don't know, it's okay to ask. We always encourage to ask that individual, tell me how your family heals. It's even okay to take an opportunity to be honest. If you're not familiar with that culture, and ask, I'd love to learn more. Can you tell me about your culture and the things you and your family use to navigate difficult times, and to celebrate good moments? These are some of the techniques that we all as therapists found helpful when making this huge transition to providing services and to individuals. But as mentioned, we really had to take a systems approach to providing services for our students and families. So I also would like to mention a little bit about what was helpful when engaging those support systems. We found that it was really important to increase that communication to support people and to collaborate with them regarding safety and privacy, even explaining why it's important to have the video camera on during sessions. We found that we had to be intentional in the ways that we described the services offered virtually, and informing our caregivers and our support people by describing teletherapy and virtual services in a way that was simple and made sense, while keeping in mind our monolingual and multilingual families. We also encouraged families to think about what would be the best way for their loved ones to receive support in a private and confidential setting. We also acknowledged that families may need more involvement versus just a phone call saying, we're making this transition. Is that okay with you? We found it important to check in more often and to include those individuals in treatment. Communicating with those support individuals throughout services was vital in that continuity of care, especially in a virtual world. So I shared a lot of information so far, and I just want to be mindful. I'm kind of throwing a lot at you all. Transitioning to virtual services is a lot of work and takes a lot from us as providers. And we often have to think on our feet about things we don't normally think about when providing in-person services. So I'd like to just take a pause and encourage you to use that chat box to maybe share some things that you found helpful when engaging in virtual services, and maybe anything that you heard me mention that you would like to try. So I'm going to pause for a moment before I jump into engaging our communities. What stood out? What's worked for you? What would you like to take with you today? And I'd also like to mention engaging the community. Martine spoke about that systems approach. So we talked about engaging the client, we talked about engaging their support system, and now we need to remember to engage their community. We found it so important to engage the community when transitioning to virtual services. In our case, we really had to engage our school partners. We had to engage other services available in the community to ask, hey, what are you doing and offering? Can that be helpful for my student? That was one of the biggest lessons learned, is to utilize the strength of involving other partners, school, parents, and community resources. As mentioned, some of our families were very difficult to get in touch with and hold of at the start of this pandemic. And we rely heavily on our school partnerships in connecting with families and collaborating regarding services. Even something as simple as saying, hey, have you heard from them? Have they reached out to you at all? We even used social media to connect with our students. And so we encourage you all to get creative and to explore every avenue available to you. One really cool thing that we were able to do is partner with our schools in posting our COVID resource booklet. And we found that although we may not have been able to get our students in the door, we were able to provide that resource to our partners, and knowing that our students and the individuals we work with may eventually come across it through another source, even if it wasn't us directly. Was there anything in that section of engaging the community that stood out to you? Is there anything else you might have tried? Please feel free to put that in the chat box so that others can learn from the experiences that you've had. And again, I'd like to ask, is there one or two things you heard that you'd like to take with you when engaging the community? Thank you for taking time to think about that.
Thank you, Deanna, for summarizing all of that so nicely. So as we conclude the content portion of our presentation, we want to just turn your attention to the handout. It's in our, our speaker page. You should see a few attachments at the bottom. So there's actually the resource packet that our team worked so hard on for your reference, as well as some more information about Mending Matters, and then not the slides, but the document that we scrolled through during our presentation. At the end of that document is a virtual considerations checklist. So we encourage you to download this checklist to your computer or print it out for your personal use. We recognize and appreciate that you all play important and very different roles in your communities. I wish we could see all of you right now and hear from you and all of the wonderful things that you do. But unfortunately, we're unable to, so I just assume that we all do a lot of different things. So with that said, we hoped you could walk away with something very tangibly that you could readily apply to your practice if you utilize a virtual platform to meet with the people that you serve. So we mapped out some hopefully applicable and accessible strategies you can apply before, during, and after working with a person through a virtual platform. And these are all things that Deanna has gone through already, that she has summarized so nicely, just different ways to engage those different support systems, as well as things that you can consider as a helping provider. And these things we've actually really applied this semester. You know, we had to walk into fall 2020 totally virtual with most of our students. Only recently have we actually gone back on campus and been able to see some students in person, but largely our work is virtual. So we've had to really work to apply a lot of these strategies that Deanna has mentioned and the ones in the handout. We haven't done an evaluation of our strategies, but I can say from personal experience that we've had a lot more success this semester in reaching our students and reaching our families and providing the support that they need. So we're hopeful that these things can be helpful for you too. So please feel free to look through it, use anything that's there. And I believe that Deanna is going to lead us into some questions to consider before we get into the Q&A.
Thank you, Caitlin. And so I just want to take a moment to pause. This is a lot of information. And like we mentioned, transitioning to virtual services requires a lot of us as helpers. So we'd like to tap into the expertise you all have. And there's a few questions that you may see here presented. How have you managed safety during telehealth sessions? What creative strategies do you use to engage the people you serve? And are there any questions that you have that may not have been answered yet? Or that you've thought of since thinking about what you do and what works? So I'm just going to give us all a moment to reflect on these questions and perhaps think of any others that you would like for us to answer in this next section of our presentation? I can only imagine what must be happening in that chat box. I'm so grateful to you all for taking a moment to think about your own experiences with virtual services and how you've planned for safety. Okay, so as we get ready to transition into our question and answer portion, we'd like to encourage you all to maybe stretch and move your body for a moment, and maybe just take just a minute to take care of yourselves as helpers and supports. We have to remember to take care of ourselves. And so we are providing a lot of information, and we want to just take a moment to pause and encourage you to stretch, maybe roll out your shoulders, take a sip of water, just take a pause to take care of yourself. Wonderful. Does that feel okay? Do we feel ready to come back? Okay. Let's jump into the question and answer portion of this presentation. So I'm seeing a question from Charles asking, while using telehealth, have you become aware of possible child abuse by the family? How did you handle it? Thank you, Charles, for that question. It's such a good question and such an important question. Yes, as we engage in virtual services, we have found times when we became aware of a safety issue and even child abuse by families. As we may know, stress increases the risk around abuse and neglect. And for many of our families experiencing high stress and quarantining in one home, we did find these challenges. And as a community and service providers, we did have to be aware of the risk for child abuse and continue to assess for concerns. One of the ways that we handled this at the start of services with any student, and we remind students and families of this when transitioning to virtual services, is providing that informed consent, which as therapist means there are limits to our confidentiality, and those limits really are around safety. So if a student or an individual has thoughts of hurting themselves or someone else, or like you're asking Charles, if a student is being hurt at home and experiencing abuse. So preparing the child and family ahead of time with what the limits of confidentiality are was really helpful in navigating those things, and letting families know that we have this responsibility as mandated reporters and that we continue to assess ongoing.
Thank you, Diana. I would like to read another question that I see from a panelist, and the question is, what are things that you have found helpful when engaging in virtual services? One of the things that I found helpful was really trying to make our interventions more creative and more interactive. And one of the first interventions that comes to mind is really allowing the student to move. For example, there was one intervention where we were able to have the student do somewhat of a show and tell. Since they were in their room or in their home, they were able to maybe go and take 1 minute to collect an item that made them feel happy, one item that they just enjoyed having, one item that helped them with stress. And they were able to collect those things, come back and share, which normally they wouldn't have these things available if we were continuing to meet at our school. And so it was really great to be able to use their environment and have them pick out things. And I think that that really helped in engagement because they can come and they can expect it to be very active and creative. So thank you, panelists, for that question.
And I'd like to answer a question that was a little bit earlier that asked, what has been your experience with telehealth? And I'm not sure if we highlighted, but most of us in our agency had not utilized telehealth whatsoever. So on Friday the 13th in March, we were all asked to do something that most of us had no experience doing. In Mending Matters specifically, we had talked about trying telehealth at some point, but really we weren't there yet until we had to be, and the pandemic sent us home. So in my personal experience, it was pretty overwhelming. I'm not very good with technology. That's why all the how-to videos that we developed as an agency, I personally just watched for myself because they were helpful. But also, it really challenged us, but we're at a point now where I think this is becoming so normal, and has provided another way for students and for people to access services where they otherwise may not be able to. So I've found that it's been pretty wonderful. I actually enjoy utilizing telehealth now that I'm more comfortable with it. So hopefully that answers that question. Yeah.
Another question that I see that really rings a bell with me is, are there situations where you don't think telehealth is appropriate? And as Diana mentioned many times, is we had to be so flexible. And in my experience, being in a rural community, the internet was very inconsistent and it would sometimes freeze, pause, it did everything except for work. And at that point, it was really important to really recognize that, hey, I need to be flexible. Maybe the student is getting a little bit frustrated, not being able to be heard, and really just taking a step back and saying, you know what, do you mind if I call you on the phone? And so we had to just really practice that. And if phone services weren't available, sometimes I even had to get more creative and just say, is there a time where you're going to be in a place where you might have more cell phone reception where we can call? And my students with cars could just drive somewhere where they were able to do that. But I think if it's not working consistently, taking a step back and thinking about what else and how else can we connect and speak to the student, even if it's not through telehealth. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Martine. And I see a question, speaking of being on the phone, there's a question asked that most people have cell phones. And are cell phones an alternative way to address and contact individuals? If your agency allows, we found that cell phones were extremely helpful in contacting the individuals we work with. If the student had a cell phone and was able to receive a text message, we found that to work really well with our specific population and connecting with students. And personally, there would be times I'd maybe call on the phone or send an email and get no response. But when I sent that text message, it was much easier to connect with that student. And so I think cell phones are a wonderful tool to connecting with individuals, and if your agency allows, I think it's a wonderful way to connect and reach out and provide those services.
I'm seeing another question sort of related to a previous question. Are there safety considerations that would make it inappropriate to do telehealth services? So when we started with telehealth initially, I think the thought was we are not going to see high risk students. A high risk meaning they have multiple suicide attempts, they're maybe potentially imminently suicidal. There's a big risk of them attempting suicide again. And in these cases, we at first felt like it would not be appropriate to see these students virtually. But when push came to shove, there really just wasn't another place for these students to be seen. And so I think one of the kind of values of our agency is providing that accessible service. And because of the pandemic, these students did not have another service to be seen. So that's why we had to make that exception for them. And so at this point, we do see students, even if they are high risk, but we make sure that we plug in their support system. We have a good safety plan in place for those students, and we make sure that they're able to access that higher level of care, meaning a hospitalization, for instance, if they need to do so. But in these cases, we need to have way more communication with the parents. We need to have way more communication with the support system to make it more appropriate and safe. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. And see that we're almost out of time, but just to add to all the amazing things Caitlin just shared about safety is really safety planning with that individual, whether it comes to issues of suicidality or child abuse, creating those safety plans and utilizing the network, as we mentioned, that systems approach. So making sure the support network knows what that safety plan is and making sure that the student knows where to access safety. If safety is not, if they need to be able to go out or take a walk or meet with someone that they really love and trust, or whether if they're not feeling safe at home, where they can go and where is a safe place for them. So safety around suicidal thoughts, safety around their environment and their caregivers. So we hope that answers all of your questions. I'm sure there's so many more, and we're sorry we weren't able to get to everything, but we are getting towards the end of our time, and we want to encourage you all, if you have questions we weren't able to answer today, please reach out. We have our contact information posted. And please use us as well as a resource as we all, as service providers, navigate this new virtual world.
Thank you, Diana. And we might have time for one more question before we close out. And I want to read one that I'm sure we all can relate to, which is boundaries. And the question is, how do you manage boundaries with text messages, especially when working with youth? And that goes to just really being clear and offering, the times that we are available, reiterating that this is not a way to reach me in an emergency, reiterating the emergency protocols. And then if it goes outside of those boundaries, to just really address it in session and just being very clear and reminding youth about those boundaries. So thank you very much for that question. So that almost wraps it up for our presentation. Again, we are so grateful for all of you guys coming here, spending this hour with us. We enjoyed it so much. We wish you all the best. Have a beautiful holiday season and a happy new year. And we hope that you found our presentation meaningful. And we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.